مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. بالنسبة للحزب الديمقراطي، السؤال المحوري اليوم ليس من الذي يسعى لنيل الترشيح الرئاسي، وإنما من الذي لا يسعى لنيل الترشيح الرئاسي. كل يوم فيما يبدو يعلن حاكم جديد أو عضو في الكونغرس أو رجل إعمال ثري عن ترشحه، بوجود أكثر من 20 مرشحا في السباق، مع توقع إعلان المزيد من المرشحين أما قريب. هل يؤذي الحزب نفسه بإرباكه أمة الشعب الأميركي بعدد أكبر من اللازم من الأسماء والوجوه والاختيارات؟ كيف سيبرز المرشح الأفضل لمواجهة دونالد ترامب وسط هذا الحشد الكبير؟ للنقاش حول الحملة الديمقراطية للرئاسة، يسرني أن أرحب بأحد المراقبين المتابعين عن كثب للسياسة الأميركية، وهو Tim Alberta. Welcome back to Dakhil Washington. They say that running for president is not a sprint, but a marathon, because it takes such a long time, but also maybe because there's such a bunch of people at the start of the race. And that certainly is what characterizes the Democratic campaign for president today. We already have more than 20 people already announced as candidates or about to be announced as candidates, and more on the way. And to discuss all this, I'm delighted to welcome Tim Alberta. Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back. So how many Democrats are already in the race?
So by my count, we have 18 declared Democratic candidates in the race, and as you just said, we're probably going to wind up with over 20 when it's all said and done, which is historic in its own right.
Now, in 2016, just a couple of years ago, there were only two real major Democratic candidates, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. Why the explosion of candidates this time around?
It's a great question. There are a couple of things I would point to. Number one, back in 2016, Hillary Clinton was essentially being coronated as the Democratic nominee. In other words, she had run in 2008 against Barack Obama. She was the favorite to win that race. And when she lost, she handled herself in a way, becoming his Secretary of State, being a team player more or less. She handled herself in such a way that she maintained her standing in the Democratic Party, and by the time 2016 came along, she was universally viewed as the heir apparent, more so than anyone else in the party. So Hillary Clinton was essentially unchallenged. It was an unwritten rule in the Democratic Party as of 2016 that nobody was going to come forth and try to take from Hillary Clinton what Barack Obama had already done 8 years prior. So I think that was a big part of it. And now I think what you're seeing today is you've had this sort of suppressed talent in the Democratic Party during 8 years of the Obama administration. Then, of course, none of them, as I just said, ran against Hillary Clinton. And so there has been this percolating pipeline of talent in the Democratic Party that has been ready to explode onto the national scene. And we're seeing that now. And of course, in the era of Donald Trump, I think it's fair to say that many of these Democrats who might otherwise not have run for president, they look at themselves in the mirror and they turn on CNN or they see the White House and they wonder, why can't I do that? If he can be president, why can't I be president?
So we know that Hillary Clinton is not running, but that other candidate from 2016, Bernie Sanders, is running. Does he have in 2018 the same magic that caused a bit of a revolution in part of the Democratic Party? Does he have that today?
I think he does, and anyone who underestimates Bernie Sanders' ability to win this party's nomination, I think is kidding themselves. Look, Bernie Sanders has never been a member of the Democratic Party, right? He is an independent senator from Vermont, and he aligns himself as a democratic socialist. What's so interesting to think about is that over the last couple of decades in American political life, the two parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, have been systematically weakened by any number of things. The outside money that has come into politics, court decisions. What's so interesting is that what you could have in 2020 is President Donald Trump standing for re-election as the Republican nominee, but he has never been a Republican in his life before running for president. And if Bernie Sanders were to win the Democratic nomination, he would be the Democratic nominee, except he's never been a Democrat in his life. So this would be really the culmination of a generation's worth of weakening of these two parties, to have the two major party nominees for president be two individuals who in fact really were never members of the party to begin with. And I think in a way that is part of Donald Trump's appeal, and it's certainly part of Bernie Sanders' appeal to a lot of folks on the left who have become disillusioned with the modern Democratic Party, who believe that it's not progressive enough, that it has not fought hard enough against the status quo in Washington. Bernie Sanders is someone who can claim to be sort of, I don't know if pure is necessarily the way he would put it, but somebody who does not have to operate within the constraints of the two-party system.
Even though he is somebody who has been in Washington for the last 30 years.
Exactly, and somebody who has not done a whole lot during that time to show that he is a change agent. In other words, he has stood for a lot of ideas that may be bold, but he has not accomplished much legislatively that people would point to and say this is somebody who can actually change the way the government works.
So let's look at some of the other insiders, at least, senators and Congress people who have put their hats in the ring. What can we say about this group?
Well, you have a number of senators. So Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, Kamala Harris from California, Cory Booker from New Jersey, Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota. Am I leaving anybody out? I mean, there are quite a few of these U.S. senators on the Democratic side who have decided to run. Kirsten Gillibrand, yes, from New York. And they all bring something a little bit different to the table. What's very interesting is that Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts was, I would say, 4 or 5 months ago, considered to be very much a top-tier contender for the Democratic nomination. Somebody who would combine the 3 M's of presidential campaigning: the money, the message, and the muscle. And universally, I think in the political class, we view those 3 things, you know, the money, the ability to raise lots of money, the message, the ability to connect with voters and talk to them about things that really matter to them, and then the muscle, which is the infrastructure, the campaign activism that you need with volunteers and with great staff work to win votes and to get out the vote and to organize your campaign. Elizabeth Warren was really viewed as somebody who could do all 3 of those things, and it's difficult to find somebody who can do all 3. And her campaign has been, I think, slightly underwhelming so far, not because of the message and not because of the muscle, but the money. She's not raised nearly as much money as some of her competitors have. In fact, when Elizabeth Warren was running for Senate, for U.S. Senate, she raised more money in those quarters than she has raised running for president, which I think is very surprising to a lot of people. And that just goes to show you how crowded this field is. She has so much competition for that small dollar fundraising base in the Democratic Party that she has struggled to raise it. And I think that on the other side of it, Kamala Harris from California is probably in a stronger position early in the race than a lot of people would have anticipated. This is somebody who's relatively new to Congress. She was just elected back in 2016. And I think the amount of traction she has gained in a short period of time is pretty surprising to a lot of Democrats.
She's the former prosecutor from California.
Yes, from
San
Francisco.
Attorney General.
That's correct.
Yeah. So those are the people from Capitol Hill. What about governors? We tend to have governors run for president. We've had some very successful Democrats and Republicans, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush. Are governors coming out to throw their hat in the ring?
You know, not as many as you would think. And it's interesting because the reason why you don't have more Democrats running is that during the Obama years, what you saw, especially out in the states, you saw it in Washington to some degree, but especially out in the states, you really saw the Democratic base, the Democratic bench, I should say, weakened pretty badly, because you saw these big Republican wave elections in 2010 and 2014 where they wiped out these Democrats in the governor's offices and in the state legislatures. So you don't have a big class of young, talented Democratic governors who have come through that pipeline. You do have a lot of senators, but not so much with the governors. So you have a handful of people like Jay Inslee, for example. He's the governor of Washington State. He's running for president. John Hickenlooper, the former governor of Colorado, he's running for president. Steve Bullock from Montana looks like he's going to run. But none of those 3 gentlemen anyone would consider to be a real viable threat to win the nomination. They could certainly capture lightning in a bottle, but they are not viewed as people who are very serious in their pursuit of the presidency. And I think, again, it's interesting because on the Republican side, to draw that parallel back to 2016, you had a handful of governors like Chris Christie and Bobby Jindal and Scott Walker, people who were viewed as very serious, very talented individuals who had worked their way through the Republican Party's bench. The Democrats don't really have those people in the governor's offices, at least not at this point.
Well, we even have this time around 1 and perhaps shortly 2 mayors trying to to build on just municipal experience and take it to the national level, one from a small town in Indiana and perhaps even the mayor of New York City.
That's right, and the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, Pete Buttigieg, is a very interesting guy, and he's somebody to keep an eye on. His stock has shot through the roof just in the last month or so, and he's a really interesting guy. He's very young, he's only 37 years old, and he's openly gay. And those two things on their face would seem to be almost disqualifying until very recently. And this is where you cannot overstate just how much Donald Trump's ascendancy has changed the dynamics of presidential politics, because those things that once seemed to be, just unthinkable are now thinkable. And Pete Buttigieg is running this really clever campaign where he's saying, look, I am the mayor of a small town in middle America, but it just so happens that the kind of people I've represented, the kind of people who I've governed in that small town in middle America, these are the same kind of people who helped elect Donald Trump president and who feel like they are being left behind in this new economy and in this diversifying country, and they're wondering where their place is and how do we get ahead and what do we do. And his whole message is about catering to people like that who are desperate for somebody to speak to them and speak to the challenges they face economically and culturally and otherwise. And so he's trying to thread this very thin needle, but so far he's done a pretty good job of it. And so as a result, you're seeing him raise lots of money and get lots of media attention. It'll be interesting to see whether or not that's sustainable over the next 9 or 10 months.
It doesn't hurt being a veteran, a Rhodes Scholar,
Yes.
all these other contrasts with President Trump.
Yes, that's exactly right. He's not just a 37-year-old openly gay man. He's got a very impressive resume, brilliant guy. But again, it's going to be, he is such an outsider. I mean, we think of outsiders as governors, as we were just discussing. The mayor of a small town in Indiana, that is a very unique resume line to be running for the presidency.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to discuss some of the other factors that differentiate one candidate from another in just a moment. Again, our guest this week is Tim Alberta. Tim is chief political correspondent for Politico, one of our nation's most influential daily news sites. In that job, Tim covers the biggest stories in politics: the 2020 presidential campaign, congressional battles between and within the two parties, and the evolving role of money in elections. Previously, he wrote for the National Journal, where he covered campaigns as senior political correspondent and Congress as House leadership reporter. So, Tim, everyone on the Democratic side seems to want to have the mantle of progressive. What does it mean to be a progressive? Is it another word for liberal? Does it mean something else?
Boy, that is a great question. So the meaning of the word progressive has probably changed quite a bit over the last decade or so. If you recall, 10 years ago, in January of 2009, when Barack Obama was sworn in as president, he was opposed to same-sex marriage, for instance. He was talking openly about deporting illegal immigrants, and in fact, in his first term in office, he deported more illegal immigrants than the previous two presidents combined. When he crafted his big health care bill, the Affordable Care Act, he did not allow Medicare for All advocates, single-payer health care advocates, to have a seat at the table when they were negotiating that bill. 10 years later, those three positions are almost unthinkable in today's Democratic Party. You've seen a significant amount of movement to the left in this Democratic Party, and frankly, on the Republican side, a significant amount of movement to the right, and those things have sort of fed off of one another. And what you've seen are both parties move a little bit farther toward their corners, respectively. Today's Democratic Party, I think it's going to be very difficult for anybody to win the nomination of that party if they are not, for instance, in favor of Medicare for All, which is a program that would essentially put every American citizen and non-citizen, depending on the specifics of the plan, under a nationalized health care system where nobody would have private insurance anymore. That is, again, an approach that would have been laughed off about 5 or 6 years ago, even in the Democratic Party, as totally unrealistic and sort of wish casting. And now it is a mainstream position, not held just by Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and some of the more liberal candidates in the race, but by Cory Booker and Kamala Harris. And it's interesting because I don't know that Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, to their core, believe in that vision as the best way to achieve healthcare reform in this country, but clearly they see the writing on the wall for where the party's headed and where the energy is in the base of the Democratic Party, and that is among this progressive wing. Another thing that I would mention is immigration. Again, for many, many years, the Democratic Party, going back to the 70s and the 80s, and certainly during the Bill Clinton presidency, the Democratic Party wanted to be very tough on illegal immigration because the base of the Democratic Party was largely made up of black voters who felt like they were hurt economically by cheap labor coming across the border. That is no longer really the case philosophically in today's Democratic Party. If any of these candidates for the presidency on the Democratic side were to come out promising tough on immigration laws and that they were going to be really tough on the border and that they were going to deport a lot of illegal immigrants, they would stand no chance of winning this nomination. So again, you've seen, and then the cultural issues, of course, same-sex marriage and abortion rights. On most of these big issues, the Democratic Party has moved to the left, and I think that there is something of a gravitational pull from the party's activists who felt as though the Obama presidency was not sufficiently progressive, that he was too much of a centrist, that he was too willing to take incremental steps instead of try to take the big step, and that has fueled this sort of disillusionment on the left that has pulled the party further in its direction.
So who would you say among this large group, certainly among the major players in this large group, is the most centrist? If Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are at one end of the spectrum, who occupies the other end?
I think that the former Vice President Joe Biden would certainly embody that more old school centrist, let's get things done Democrat, somebody who is a little bit less interested in the big litmus tests of the day, whether they be on the cultural issues or on immigration or healthcare or whatever, and would approach voters and say, look, here's what we can get done. Here's what's realistic. Here's what I would like to see happen, and here's who I'm willing to work with to get it done. Joe Biden is a pragmatist. He's a very practical politician. He spent 4 decades in Washington working largely across the aisle to get a lot of things done. That's going to be baggage for him. He's going to be attacked by other Democrats for that record of working with Republicans, for being a moderate, for being a centrist. And so on the one hand, in a general election, what could be a real strength for Joe Biden, which is his record of accomplishment, bipartisan achievement, it is going to be a real vulnerability for him.
Let me ask you about identity politics. Among the names that you referred to earlier, many women, many African Americans, very few white males, Joe Biden in his own category here. How powerful is identity politics in today's Democratic Party?
Extremely. And what you're going to see is this inevitable backlash, and you're already beginning to see the front end of it, because with this very diverse field that you were just describing, as of now, when you look at the top of the field and the people who are in this sort of top tier, that upper crust who look to be the most viable early on, they largely are white males. It's Bernie Sanders and it's Joe Biden. It's Beto O'Rourke, the former Texas Senate candidate whose real name is Robert. He's a white man. Beto might lead you to believe he's Hispanic, but he's a white man. And Pete Buttigieg, who's gained a lot of steam, as we were talking about a minute ago. So you've got 4 of the real hot, top-tier, viable candidates who have the potential to raise lots of money and who have a lot of media buzz and who are making a lot of good staff hires and people who are viewed as very serious contenders. They are all white males, whereas some of the women, like Elizabeth Warren and like Kirsten Gillibrand from New York, and even like Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, women who in their own right throughout their careers have been viewed as very serious and very capable politicians and people who could make a real run for the presidency, the fact that they have not gained that traction yet while these white men have, it is going to be a source of resentment in the party. It already is. You're beginning to pick up some of that chatter from Democratic voters, and it's going to be very interesting to see where that takes the party. We're very early in this process, but if in fact, coming down the home stretch late this year toward the Iowa caucuses, early 2020, if in fact most of the top-tier contenders at that point still are white men, that could signal something of sort of an emergency for the Democratic Party, because the voters have made it very clear that at this point, what they don't want to see is just another ticket with 2 white men. So there would have to be some sort of accommodation with putting either a woman or a minority on the ticket as a vice presidential nominee.
So let's take this whole group and ask this question. How does the Democratic Party organize its primary system over the next year to produce the best candidate to defeat Donald Trump?
It's almost impossible to engineer your primary that way, and that's the tricky thing. Party primaries are typically drawing participation from the most energized, the most passionate voters. So in a typical year, a party primary, even for the presidency, will draw something between 10 and 15%, maybe 15 to 20% of voters overall from the party. That 10 to 15% of voters who come out to vote in these primaries, they're not the casual voters. They're not the people who are sort of reasonable and who read the newspaper every day and think, oh, that person makes an interesting point, or that person makes... No, I mean, these are the people who are really fired up.
Very interesting. Tim Alberta, thank you so much for helping us understand how the Democratic Party is organizing itself for 2020.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
As of this filming, there are almost 20 declared Democratic candidates for president. They include current and former senators and members of Congress, current and former governors, a mayor, a former cabinet member, and at least one businessman. And before long, the list is likely to include a former vice president, Joe Biden, who is in the final stages of deciding to join the race. By the time this show airs, he may even be in the race. On the surface, this long list of Democratic candidates mirrors the long list of Republican candidates in 2016. Remember that campaign? That year, Democrats had only two main candidates, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. More than a dozen men and women competed for the right to carry the Republican flag into the election. In that primary campaign, Donald Trump proved to have the winning strategy. He figured out that occupying the most extreme position on the political spectrum would give him the ability to own a rock-solid percentage of the vote. And that would drive other candidates progressively out of the race. The key was to make sure that there was no one to the right of Trump. No one was tougher on immigration, tougher on trade, tougher on getting rid of Obamacare. That's what the base wanted, and that's what he delivered. It was a brilliant idea, and it carried him to the nomination. This time around, Democrats will face a similar situation. Will the strategy be to see who can occupy the space furthest to the left, the candidate who is most critical of the excesses of capitalism, the candidate who is most critical of border security, the candidate who is most critical of step-by-step reform, of health care and education, and the one who wants revolutionary change right now? Personally, I hope that's not the case. America is a country of persistent but incremental change. Our great leaders had big ideas, but pursued them slowly. Lincoln and slavery, Roosevelt and Social Security, Kennedy and civil rights. They all had big ideas, but implemented them step by step. It's the American way. I hope our next campaign moves our national discussion back to the middle ground of American political debate and away from the extremes. Debates can still be deep and powerful with differences that really matter. It's the type of debate about both ends and means I believe most Americans want. بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول كيف يختار الحزب الديمقراطي مرشحه الرئاسي، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ InsideWashington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.